Hey, everybody. I'm back with my good friend Jake, my fellow astrology colleague and the founder of the Koryos Academy. Back by popular demand, he is here to talk with me today about Julius Evola's Eros and the Mysteries of Love. We are going to use this book as a sort of springboard for a wider discussion of Eros and probably a few tangential topics along the way. We'll see where the discussion takes us. So, welcome to the show, Jake. If we can call it a
Thank
show,
you.
it's kind of a once off.
That's all right. Whenever I randomly appear, but thank you nonetheless.
All right. So, I think we'll start off with a discussion of this myth of the hermaphrodite because you said something to me that was really interesting the other day that you have a sort of disagreement with Evola's take on this. And
Yeah.
I found this so interesting. I'm hoping you'll explain it in detail to everybody. But in a nutshell, Evola's view of the hermaphrodite is essentially that we're sort of seeking the other person to sort of recreate this union of man and woman to this original primordial hermaphroditic state, this divine person that is of a dual nature.
Correct.
And that this is at sort of at the basis of the drive for Eros, is that we're seeking that union. And I understand that there are a lot of the things about this that you do agree with. So maybe you can sort of just give a quick overview of the parts you do agree with and then take us on this, what I think is going to be kind of a fascinating rabbit hole. And I'm really excited to sort of explore this later on my own time, some of these threads that you're probably going to untangle for us. But please tell us, what is your disagreement with Evola on this?
Well, like you, I have to follow the threads a bit further, but um, the parts I do agree with that we are dual natured beings. I think everybody's familiar with the yin and yang sign, right? So within each half is a bit of the other. So there is this natural like gravitas that pulls us to things that are complementary with us, and um, the idea of union, be it with through Eros, which we manifest as a partner or an ideal partner that we put on this pedestal, or just seeking the divine, like in the mystical union sense. These things I do agree with, but the process that unfolds when the cosmic egg cracks, right, when the separation occurs, I think it's important to follow like the history of religion's angle of when these developments, when these myths show up, and try and suss out what is authentic to, in particular, European tradition and what may come from Eastern or Middle Eastern sources. So, for instance, in the Garden of Eden, which is much later in history as far as myths go than certainly the Vedas or other Indo-European strains, there's the notion of the fall, right? The fall from grace, the forbidden fruit, all these sorts of things, and there's definitely um, some milk there to get out that you can learn from, you can grow from. But the original splitting of the two, at least in the Indo-European context, does not seem to indicate or contain this notion of a fall, a negative state of man. There is sky earth as a single being, a hermaphrodite that is dual natured, and then a third party, either from within or from without, separates the two to create space, to create Midgard, this middle yard, where life can then begin as a mixture of heaven and earth. And so we have, of course, like our terrestrial nature, our bodies, our lower nature, our animal instincts, and we have our philosophy and our spiritual higher nature, but they're intertwined and they're immanent within one another. And so I think it's important to hold that in mind because that's the earlier view. And so something takes place in the Middle East predominantly, where that is then layered on with this idea of negative connotation for life itself, being here, Earth is a prison, all the Gnostic stuff. And that doesn't seem to me to be very in accordance with the European tradition prior to Christianity, prior to its, especially in Greece, right? Early Judaism. So if we go back and we can reconstruct these myths and find the perennial threads through all of the Indo-European diaspora, then you can start to piece together what the original Proto-Indo-European myth may have looked like. And that seems much more of a sacrifice on the part of the gods or the god in order to facilitate and gift life. And that comes with struggle, that comes with the tension of being a dual natured being. And it is our task to overcome that and to unify those two, but not in some sort of purgation. I mean, I think purgation maybe is the wrong word, because there certainly is an element of that, like an alchemical sense of refinement, but not as a punishment. Like I don't think we're here because we were punished and forced to live. I think, especially when we look at like the Celtic or Germanic worldview, there's a zest for life. The struggle is life, or even like in the Iliad, right? This contest of life and death, and facing one's doom with heroic bravery and overcoming that as a testament, as a monument. Of course, these people built giant monuments, the Kurgans, to signify individuals who did just this. This seems to me a much more life-affirming path than, woe is me, I'm a fallen man, I must return to God. I don't personally believe that the gods view it that way, and I don't think our ancestors did either, until the mixture with the Middle Eastern current, which, certainly even without the religiosity, there's a worldview there that's prevalent even today, that is a bit pessimistic. It doesn't like beauty. It doesn't like the way things are. It's got to shake it up. It's got to change it. Perhaps it's a strain of idealism. I'm not sure, but it doesn't feel.
Do you mean kind of like this view that this world is sort of inherently sinful and bad, and we're trying to escape this world, and we need to escape from the flesh?
Right. The notion of original sin. So, for instance, like if we look at the Germanic creation myth, right? So originally there's these two primordial elements, ice and fire. They meet, a being is formed. That being then is dismembered to create the world, to create the cosmos by the gods. And there's driftwood in the ocean that washes up from the blood of this hermaphrodite that was split. So sky earth is split, and in the bones and in the wake of that, there's wood, trees, and the gods breathe life into that to give which forms the original man. In the Vedic, we have, there's the hymn to Purusha where he's dismembered, creating the castes and creating the world. But in the Rig Veda in particular, Rudra sees the copulation between sky, and in this case, it's his daughter, which makes sense if you think of like a primordial god. Everything flowing from him is a child, even if it becomes a spouse. And that's seen as like an act of aggression, that there has to be a separation, otherwise nothing can come to fruition. So Rudra shoots the plague arrow, splits the two, and it's determined to be the well-performed sacrifice, right? So the god is sacrificed, the hermaphrodite is sacrificed into two halves, and fire / procreative fluid from the god rain down and springs up life, trees into humans yet again. So there doesn't seem to me like, perhaps as a consequence, you could say, there's a fallen state. It's a consequence that life sprung up in the in-between of heaven and earth. But it's not a fall put on man, if anything. Yeah, I think that's the big contextual difference is the blame isn't placed on man. Man is created in the process, but he is what he is. He has his place in the hierarchy. And that's different than saying the fall occurred because of man, or the temptation of the serpent and all. There's plenty of ways to cast it, but at least in Middle Eastern thought, it seems to be the fall is the fault of woman and man. And I don't know if that's an organic Indo-European belief.
So you're basically saying that this concept, and correct me if I'm wrong, this concept of the fall the way that it's perceived is that this is something bad. This splitting is the result of something bad that happened, like a calamity or whatever, or sin, or however it's conceptualized. And you're saying that as far as you can tell from your research, that this doesn't seem to be an original belief of the Indo-Aryans. Is that correct?
Yes and no, because when we bring in the term Aryan, which I love the term, don't get me wrong, that's a
It has
specific.
been a bit abused in modern times.
Well, no, but there's a specific group called the
Mhm.
Aryan, and those were the descendants of the Pi culture that then had gone down through the Middle East, mixed with the Middle Easterners before they went to India and wrote down the Vedas and established the Vedic culture there. So already we have a mixture with non Pi stock, right? So the Proto Indo
Mm.
Europeans were essentially Eastern hunter gatherers plus Western hunter gatherers plus a little bit of Caucasus hunter gatherers after the Ice Age, around like 6,000 years ago. The ones that went west, like I like to say, chasing the sun, went into old Europe where they interacted with people that were also themselves having some biology in Western hunter gatherers. So it was predominantly like an Eastern hunter gatherer strain of DNA that then encountered Western hunter gatherers. And the cults that spring up there are very different in a lot of ways. To the further south you get, you have, of course, like the first wave of what would become the heroic Greeks. They basically were an offshoot of Yamnaya, which is kind of the culture that they associate with late Proto-Indo-European. And you see this reflected in things like Homer. But by the time we get to like Plato or we get to these other thinkers, it's already started to change, right? It's already started, not to rag on Plato. Certainly he brought a lot to the table. But the conception of life as a prison or this thing we have to get out of comes later. And so when you read, for instance, the Rig Veda, there's a lot that's quite different than when you get later on the Upanishads, because that degradation continued, right? So you have the stock that already had been in the Middle East, but they have these ideas and these themes, but then it gets a little incorporated with the beliefs of the host culture. And then you arrive at Hinduism today, which is quite different than the Vedic religion. It didn't it didn't go that same way when it went into Europe, because they were already interacting. Like the people like to think, the hunter gatherers or whatever, the European farmers, for instance, were the population that the Pi descendants interacted with in Europe, that they were matriarchal and really peace-loving. That's not what the archaeology says at all. That mass genocide, extremely violent people, and then you get a huge wave of Indo-Europeans that are also very genocidal and very patriarchal. So I think there was a fusion there that's more in line with the original Proto-Indo-European beliefs than what you would see in a Middle Eastern context or certainly late stage Vedic context. So for instance, like the Bhagavad Gita, right, comes quite a bit later from the Vedas. Now we're talking about transcendence. Now we're talking about all the universal God, all these sorts of things. If you go back to the Vedas, that's not quite what the beliefs were. So trying to find that perennial current that's closest match to what the Pi culture would have believed is, I think, really crucial in understanding this development of the notion of the fall.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, I think I remember you saying in our sort of pre-show conversation that this myth of the hermaphrodite is like super old, like maybe
Right.
even pre-Ice Age.
Yeah, because there's elements of it with Native Americans that share patriarchal DNA with the Indo-Europeans. Presumably, they were Eastern hunter-gatherers that went over through Alaska, came down into North America. But there's certain elements of their mythology, not all of the tribes, because some of them came up from South America, right?
Yeah. Well,
But the
Evola
one,
talks about that in Revolt even. I think it's in the chapter towards the end of the book, tradition and anti-tradition, and he talks about the various cycles. And he even mentions something similar to what you're just describing, is that you had these sort of like lunar cultures, these cultures of the snake or whatever, that were then supplanted by a much more brutal warrior culture who emphasized the symbol of the eagle instead.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, you can see it even when early settlers started romanticizing the noble savage, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they saw this guy on horseback shooting bows and arrows, scalping people. It reminded them of their Pi ancestors, most likely. They
Yeah,
didn't
that's really
make
interesting.
that correlation. They didn't know it, and we're only really discovering it now. But I think there's a true differentiation between those two spirits, and that untamed brutality is certainly what was carried forward with Indo-European expansion. And as it encountered other cultures, it refined and it grew and it changed itself. But it doesn't seem, at least at its early stages, to have any inclusion of this notion of the fall, other than we know that part of us comes from up there and part of us comes from down here. And we're a mixture of the two. And they can be at odds with one another. There's that, Eros tension. But I think putting the blame or turning it into a moralistic thing is where the folly begins, because a lot of what Evola and other writers like Guinan characterize as traditional, right, are traditional in so much as they hadn't found earlier evidence, because archaeology, linguistics, DNA hadn't it is now at a later stage in its development to where we can peer further into the past than they could. So it's not to fault them, but if you're looking for the oldest thing, right, everybody goes straight to Egypt. Well, look at all of the pre-dynastic, early dynastic, and late dynastic changes that took place in even Egypt. So to try to get to the core of that perennial current, you have to look in multiple places. And if it checks across all of those, well, then you can put it in the basket of this was probably part of the original tradition. If it's an outlier, and that outlier just so happens to ping to a certain geographical area, namely the Middle East and North Africa, well, there's a reason for that. It probably came from a different strain of belief.
Yes. So it seems like the primary spiritual goal of these Indo-European societies, this sort of Aryan warrior culture, was to gain this everlasting glory through acts in this world, rather than trying to escape this world and then attain like this mystical union with the divine.
Right.
Would that be correct to say?
Yeah, I think so, because again, citing the Iliad, right? Like there's this constant lamentation of the cruel fate, the cruel doom that has been spun for the heroes. And yet, how do they greet that? Not by running away, not by trying to meditate out of it or transcend it, but by meeting it head on and proudly staring death down as they know they're going to die. And then you're memorialized eternally for that everlasting fame. And that really goes back to the cult of the ancestors, which, and when we talked about the Grail, at least from my view, this early conception of the Grail has everything to do with the cult of the ancestors and one's life actions adding further broth, further richness to that cup that is then passed around the ceremonial fire as people recount these heroic deeds of the men of old. But they have to do better than them, right? They have to add their worth to that cup. They have to add their vitality, their spirit, so that those who come after them can continue to drink from the cup. That's a different take than what it certainly turns into with like the Christian Grail legends, right? That all of that, and it's not to say that if Christ was truly God incarnate and he sacrifices himself gladly for all of mankind, like that's pretty heroic. So there is a connection there, but the further back you go, the more it seems that, at least for the men, and I can't speak of like the Earth Mother cults or anything like that, but this ambition to leave a mark that then is worthy of leaving a physical mark, right? A kurgan, a huge burial mound, songs told about you. That seems to be the prime driving force and the prime motivator for the Indo-European expansions, is to gain fame and renown. It could be easily characterized as an egoic thing, but it doesn't seem to be, because it's an imperative, right? It's just how they are, and it's more vitalistic and more life affirming than assuming these are just men that wanted to, that it was all for their glory. Because then oftentimes you would see, for instance, like the king or the tribal chieftain, when they go raid some cattle and they get it, what is the first thing he does? He gives it all away to his people, to his first warriors, his second class warriors. It's that reciprocity. And I think that reciprocity is kind of the core element of, we've been given life. We've been given this gift called life. What are you going to do with it? And is that worthy of life itself? Because you have to live. It's like, again, living in the spirit of the Grail. You're imbued with that immortal elixir, because your actions are tied to your ancestors' actions, which are tied to your descendants' actions, and all of it compounds into this vital force that then is overflowing, which then can be turned into abundance and prosperity for the people that follow you. But that seems to be the core in my mind.
I think it's probably worth noting that this isn't just like ego glory. This is a spiritual glory. It's like the Persian Vareno, or maybe even you could call it vril if you want to use like a more new agey term or something. But it's something that, it's not glory that everybody's praising you because you conducted a great slaughter on the other tribe. It's that you have overcome something within yourself. You have reconciled this inner spiritual tension, and it's that overcoming that makes it into this sort of divine act, and that produces this glory, which was said to be the glory of kings, right? And so where that then kind of ties back into Eros is that what Evola is saying in the book is that Eros is kind of like that. You need to use the tension of Eros to overcome that lower nature within yourself, and in doing so you achieve this spiritual glory. And we find that theme, in the Grail legends as well, but also through just a whole variety of myths throughout traditional cultures. And, so this idea that Eros can kind of be used to sort of create contact with the divine through the overcoming of one's lower nature. But from what I understand of what you're saying that that's all well and good, but the premise that it arises from is really important, because the premise will create a divergence at some point.
For sure. And once you've kind of noted the divergence, then things like woman as death make a lot more sense, right? Because I know we're going to talk about it later, but like the hatred between the lovers, right? Or the tragic end between the lovers. It is the hero's destiny to die, ideally in combat, in glory. And there's, when Hector is outside the gates and he's running for his life from Achilles, and then the gods show themselves to him in the likeness of his brother, and they say, let's make a stand. And he's imbued, he's warring with himself internally. I can't return to the gates because I'll be so shamed. But if I stay here and face Achilles, I will be slain. And ultimately he decides that's the better end. So it's this hatred for death, but also this inevitable gravitational pull towards it that is coincidentally the only path for fame and glory anyway, right? So that divergence then sets up a whole slew of processes that can be utilized with the force of Eros. That I think it's also not coincidental that as the Indo-Europeans really start to shape up in Europe and become the ruling dynasties and all that sort of stuff, we also see the emergence of what we would really consider to be European phenotypes, like in the classical beauty sense, right? So there's probably more than one reason for this shift from just glory in combat to the glory for a woman. because they're seeing something beautiful that's worth fighting and living for. Both arrive at the same point of, are you willing to lay down your life? Are you willing to make sacrifices and carry forward this painful turmoil for a higher cause? How that's elicited, how that is prompted in the individual does seem to change in the history of Eros. But I think initially it's that pure essence, I think it was Evola. I could be wrong, but the blood of the heroes is closer to God than the ink of the philosophers or the prayers of the faithful, because that impulse to lay down one's life in service of something higher is also deeply tied to that higher calling of glory, because it's not just your glory. Like in the Vedas, before battle and all that, they're having their soma rituals and all these sorts of things. What do? They invoke Indra, they invoke Rudra, and afterwards they thank them for their spoils. You see this across all Indo-European culture. So it can't be just reduced to a feat of ego, because right from the start and right to the end, the glory is given back to the divine. It's just, how did you wield that glory? How did you wield Eros in the process? And that I think is what's important, to find the roots of what the actual impulse was and what was the traditional view.
Right. And Eros is kind of emblematic of this broader theme of the tension of the two polarities that underlies the cosmos, the tension of the masculine and the feminine, or Shiva Shakti, or spirit and matter, whatever somebody wants to call it. And so, you kind of need, for the hero, in order to become a hero, in order to attain this glory, he has to have a certain titanic element within himself that he's overcoming. It's essential to be of a dual nature in that regard. Right. So I could see why you would say it's not necessarily like a fallen state, but, you do have that whole splitting of the cosmic egg where its dual nature has caused it to sort of crack because it's turned in on itself in some way, right, shape, or form, many variations of that myth. But there is this idea that this dual nature is kind of essential and inherent to the cosmos. And that's what I think makes Eros really interesting as a concept, because the tension that underlies Eros, that underlies sexual attraction, is a tension that is present through all of creation and is a necessary part of creation. And maybe this kind of goes into like the hatred that's kind of essential between lovers. There's a way in which these two polarities are complete opposites, and they're in a way existential enemies. Right. Mm-hmm. They're both oriented towards completely different things, two very different ways of being. And so I think when kind of considering this myth of the hermaphrodite, I do think Evola is probably correct in that the way that he's using it to describe that Eros as being an impulse towards a reunification with the other, yeah, I don't think that's necessarily incorrect. But I do think that you bring up a really good point, that the premise is really important, and that if you're looking at it from the perspective of a fallen state, you are going to come to different conclusions than if you just see it as a necessity of creation, and that there's nothing inherently bad about it. Yeah. Would you agree with that?
100%. So Eros is the byproduct of the separation, right? Mm-hmm. So without the separation, there's nothing to even talk about. None of this would be. We'd all be in a state of pure being, right? I think it's an interesting analogy because it's so emblematic to consider the sun, right? So the sun exists because of nuclear fusion, two opposite parts melding together. The hatred arises if we extrapolate on that into a very human context, because you lose yourself in that process. There is no individual anymore. You are melded together with another, and the ego, you could call it the Luciferian element, wants to rebel again. It wants to retain its identity. It wants to stand alone. That's that titanic impulse. But what happens with the sun when this nuclear fusion arrives? it creates an abundance of energy and it ripples out every once in a while. And oh, by the way, it's what gives us life. So I think it is correct to look at it as a naturally unfolding mechanism, this unification of opposites that then has to be split either because of some strange quantum law that we're unaware of or just because of the ordinance of the fates. I don't know. But when it splits, something escapes that connection, and that is always going to be tied to that magnetic draw to pull it back towards itself. But it's also what facilitates life itself. It's what sets us on this journey. We all will live and die, most likely live again, and that loop, it's like a giant feedback loop, right? So there's the departure, there's the fall. You could think about it like quite literally the light bringer falling out of the sun, right? Bringing down light, bringing down something, but it's differentiated only to go on this whole path just to return yet again. So you can consciously hold that and you can work with that through Eros, but I would argue that it's certainly a natural process because it's the natural process that gives rise to the experience itself. And if there's no experience, if there's only a pure state of being, and there's no moment of differentiation, we talked about before, like my conception of time is the measurement from departure of source to now and to return to source. That's the full clock. So without that departure, without that leaving the kingdom to have the experience of life as a dual nature being, feeling this longing, feeling this tension of this isn't all there is, doesn't preclude living a good life and doing as much as you possibly can with that brief moment of eternity that you've been gifted.
Right. And so I think, like to kind of take something you said, well, just now and also previously, and sort of segue it into like this connection between love and death. So when you've got that impulse towards that union, when Eros arises, Evola describes it as kind of like a trauma at the center of one's being.
The
like
crisis of coitus is his favorite term, right?
Yes. Well, I think that's specifically referring to the spasm, as he calls it. But he kind of, he describes Eros as being like this deadly wound of an arrow. And so you got all the imagery of like Cupid's arrow shooting through the heart and everything like that. But he's saying like it provokes this displacement of the ego. It kind of shifts you out of your regular waking ego consciousness. And, in the moment of the crisis of coitus, that reaches its peak. And he even says it's actually kind of hard to study what happens for people at the moment of orgasm because your consciousness is kind of like not really fully there. So it's kind of hard to report back on it. Is it, done right should kind of take you into this otherworldly state where you can't like a fever dream of some kind, right? And so, but he's saying that like if you were to only kind of stimulate Eros on this very elementary plane and just keep it on like this profane level of human infatuation, and it fails to shift that consciousness and displace the ego, then it, like just to stimulate just material desires, like it just carnal lust or whatever, then Eros tends to provoke a lot of suffering and pain. It becomes this all-consuming anguish with no outlet. And he quotes Novalis as saying something to the effect of, very few people know the mystery of love. They only know unending hunger and everlasting thirst, or something to that effect. And I think that's really interesting because that's sort of like that quality of suffering also seems to be very related to this theme of death, because he talks about how, it's very common in the language of lovers to be like, oh, I would die without you. And, so there's this sense that like, once you find your soulmate, your other half, your twin flame, whatever you want to call it, there's this sense that like, oh, this person is my other half. They're the yang to my yin and vice versa. And I can't live without them. And if I can't have them, I would rather die. So
Yeah.
there's that sense of like, there's almost a sense of incompleteness without it, where, anybody who's ever been through like a bad breakup, for example, or had unrequited love for a crush or something like that, life kind of just feels like it's got all the color sucked out of it when that love is no longer returned. And so it does tend to like cause this suffering that's almost due to like this intense meditation on the other person is really
Right.
like when you're newly in the throes of love, right? What do? You just fantasize endlessly about the other person. You think of them constantly. You imagine your future together. That is a meditation in a sense. So there is, you see that in the profane sphere of this desire for the union. And if that's lacking, life feeling like it has no purpose. Now, that's not quite linked into like love as death, but there's a relationship to it, I think. But maybe keeping it on a more profane sphere. I'm just curious what you might think of that.
It makes me think of the phrase lovesick, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's there's a couple things, but the first I want to touch on is, again, if we look at Rig Veda, it's Rudra that separates sky and earth. Rudra is a god associated with arrows, and specifically plague arrows. So if there was a huge plague, it was the work of Rudra. And yet Rudra is the Koryos god and also associated with fertility and the renewal of the land. So I think he's a death god, right? So like now the Agori, for instance, worship Shiva Rudra on cremation grounds. So there's this deep tie-in to death already, and being lovesick and willing to die for another. So I mean, when you're really deeply in love, like I can speak from personal experience from multiple occasions, but with my wife, we basically ruined our lives in order to be together. And I wouldn't change it. I think it was the right, I mean, it was definitely that feeling of I've been shot with a plague arrow, and like this is not even my own actions. I could see
Like you're
the
possessed by a force beyond yourself.
right. And you can see the logical action. You can see the respectable action in often cases, but you through no will of your own choose another action. And that is Eros, like to the T, is this third state that possesses one to be completely and utterly consumed with what will result in your individual death. So it's such a paradox, and but again, if we look at it as a natural occurring thing, from the cosmological scale on down to our own human anatomy and physiology, that love sickness, that pure tension, regardless of intelligence, regardless of being able to see the more logical path, possesses one to lay down their life in one way or another. And I think that consumption effect, that burning fire, is really important, because when we're in the throes of love, and it does consume our whole being, and we feel like either we found our other half, or we can't be whole unless we're with that person. That's the process of death right then and there. And so it can obviously be elevated at developmental stages of life, but obviously towards the end of life, of I want to be whole until I return to God, I return to the gods, I go to the ancestors, whatever it may be. It's the same impulse, it's the same drive, but for whatever reason, it is elicited most profoundly and most sensationally, where we can all note it in the attraction between lovers. And that attraction between lovers, that bitter, beautiful pain that is love, again, can only experience if there is separation. So it's a lot of couples, if they spend too much time together, they get sick of each other. But then one of them has to leave for work, whatever, and they're writing letters, and that flame starts to come back, because there's something inherent in the separation between lovers the difference between life and death. You long to be with your departed kin. That's all deeply linked to just the mechanism that Eros provides. And so, although it's an extremely difficult, razor's edge to traverse effectively or to conceptualize in a way that you can integrate it, it's nevertheless something that really is the basis for life itself. It gives the richness of context. It gives the richness of opposing forces, and us in this middle ground, trying to contend with those two halves of ourselves. But only if you elevate it to that kind of spiritual, metaphysical value is there real fruit to gain. Otherwise, you're just lovesick and going insane, and you don't know what's happening.
Right. What you were saying made me think of two things. The first one was how you said you and your wife kind of basically ruined your lives in order to be together.
Oh, yeah.
And Evola talks in the book about how it's just kind of like widely understood through like all these ancient cultures that yes, love basically just possesses people and you can't expect them to act rationally, and we just got to give these people a pass. But there is like this inherently destructive quality to Eros in that regard. And he says, like, on the plane of the mundane and social life, it can just be absolutely devastating. And when two people fall in love, like, maybe you fall in love with somebody who's of another class, or there's some other reason you're not supposed to be together or something. And like people just throw away like their reputation. They'll have conflict with their families. Like they'll do anything to be with this person. And like this madness consumes them. But when you talked about like this separation being almost like a necessary component of it, it reminded me of a quote that Evola uses, and he refers to it as being somewhat anomalous, but from Guido Cavalcanti, who said that love arises from and dwells in the sky of Mars and not Venus. And Venus, who comes from and dwells with Mars, and says that Dante seems to have shared that opinion. And I think that's really interesting, considering Mars's significations of being something that cuts and severs and separates and destroys. That, and of course, Mars is the planet associated with the passion, the like passionate love. Venus, everybody thinks, oh, Venus is romance. Venus must be love and sex. And she's only love and sex in the sense of the coming together. But that coming together can only happen if there's the split in the first place. That is very Martian.
Right. And right there, we're back to perhaps the original conception of Mars and Eros.
And it's linked to this warrior culture.
Exactly. I mean, think of it again, Iliad. They're constantly lamenting, oh, I'll never go home to my wife. Oh, somebody else is going to take my kingdom. Oh, my wife will be sold into slavery. Like those are the concerns. And yet, what are they doing? They're going to war. It's not a new phenomenon. When man is most capable of enduring the hardship of warfare and combat with love in his heart, that's why, in the chivalric times, they would have, the handkerchief or the token of the beloved, even if they had never even seen them. It might just be a letter from them, because that allows the process of Eros to grow and that longing to grow. So where Parsifal is, he's hacking people down left and right, he's just causing all this mayhem. But what's he actually doing? He's just fantasizing about his wife. He's not even thinking about war, although he's triumphant in war. I think it's not one or the other. They're one and the same thing. Or maybe it's yet another dyad with yin and yang, where love and war, that's a pretty common thing, right? So like,
yeah, it's like a dyad within a dyad.
Right. It's a dyad within a dyad, but Eros is the connecting fiber, is the way I would view Eros. They're yes. Not separated by necessity, and that again, it's like the sun. This involution, this impulsion force is Eros. But it can only exist if there is separation. Otherwise, there is no Eros. So how to raise that Kundalini or gravity or whatever analogy you prefer, or to hold it like we often talk about in astrology, how to hold that tension, how to manage that tension. They can't meet. If they meet, it could all go awry. and maybe they can meet. And this probably would be, with the prohibitions about taking a woman or consummating a marriage for the chivalric orders, because the second it's completed, now there is a fall, because that lofty pedestal has been knocked down to the harsh reality of, this is just another human. We've been possessed by something else. So is it possible to cultivate and contain and utilize Eros with knowing that and still consummate? Probably, but it's definitely the harder path, because that prolonged separation, that necessity of separation, is what further strengthens Eros. Unless there's a higher intelligence cultivated within Eros to utilize it effectively. Because then you have things, like the what I'm thinking, the Kama Sutra, right? There's ways to stoke that Eros with a lover intentionally, but without proper training, and certainly in modernity, without any type of initiatory rites, like, you are playing with fire, you're playing with Mars, and Eros is facilitating it.
Yes. And I think, it's interesting because in sort of like modern masculinity dialogue and stuff, you do hear them talk a lot about how, you need to get control of your sexual urges, and they do like the whole no fap November stuff. But I've always looked at that and thought, I feel like they're kind of going down the wrong track with that. Like, the intentions are maybe right, but the execution is very, very flawed, in that they tend to try to suppress the Eros or repress it. And then that's very unhealthy, and that causes a lot of psychological damage. Evola even talks about this right at the opening of chapter 5 in Eros and the Mysteries of Love, if I remember right, about how, because that's the chapter on like the sacred ceremonies and stuff. Yeah. And he's like really clear that like, we're not talking about a suppression or a repression of the urge. What we're doing is we are bringing it up and raising it to like this fever pitch and using it to strengthen oneself against. And so there's the example of, this little known tradition of the Asag, where the man and woman spend the night in bed together, separated only by a sword, and neither one of them can cross it. And Miguel Serrano talks a lot about this in his books as well. He's like, that seems to be like central in like a lot of his stories, but it actually doesn't have, like, there are a few historical references to it, but it's a little bit mysterious. However, I think it is a really good example of how that would work, in the sense that, okay, you're intentionally like putting yourself in this situation where consummation is a very real possibility, and it's totally upon you and the exercising of your own will to not give in to that. But you're not supposed to like sit there and think of your grandmother. You're still supposed to be like quite like, you want to stoke that arousal. And this is like, this kind of goes back to like having that Titanic element that the hero needs to be able to overcome. So you can never really drop that tension. It's to increase the tension. And then that tension fuels basically like the warrior nature. And now because he's overcome this, he's had a spiritual victory. He's gained the glory. Now he can kind of take that and carry it through the rest of his life. And this seems to be, the purpose of this symbol of the woman, whether she was real or imagined. This symbol of the woman is very, very prevalent throughout mythology, and especially is like within these chivalric legends and such that I know you're really interested in, the Grail legends. You see this over and over, that the woman is what the man keeps in his mind as he goes upon his quest. And even though he's separated from her, that doesn't seem to matter. The separation actually seems to enhance the victory that he gains. And interestingly, of course, Venus is one of her what's the word I'm looking for? It'll come to me. Like her one of her manifestations, not quite the word I was going for, but it'll work. One of her manifestations is this Venus Victrix, the bringer of
Yeah.
victory on the battlefield. And she's kind of like linked to the Valkyries and things like that. So once again, we have this tie-in back with this Venus Mars stuff. Oh, she's on this very Marsy battlefield where all this Marsy stuff is happening, and she's looking out for these Marsy warriors, and she's kind of just waiting there to bestow the victory on those who earn it.
And with that ceremony, what is separating them? An emblem of Mars. It's a sword, presumably a double-edged sword, because death on either side of it. I think it's interesting too that with like the chivalric orders and certainly in the Grail legends, what is separating them? Warfare. There, or be it jousting or going to actual war, there's Mars is what is the separation. What is facilitated by the separation is Eros. So there's, like you said, it's like a dyad within a dyad. It's also interesting, in Norse legends, right? We have Odin and Freya, and although I would argue that Frigga and Freya are one and the same being, Freya is a specific emanation that is very much tied to, for instance, Sidir, right? So the forbidden woman arts that Odin happens to learn from her, and he's shamed for it. Men aren't supposed to practice Sidir, but he's the war god. So there's just these complex overlays again and again of warriors, warfare, and lovers. Love and death, it's all deeply entwined together, like two strands of DNA. And the overarching theme that then really takes precedent is knowing all that. How do you utilize Eros? And I think that is what Evola is trying to point out in his framing it metaphysically, is that begins with understanding and conceptualizing it at a much higher plane than this profane one. Because without that knowledge and without that framing, it's just warfare. It's just hacking people to bits and dying in each other's arms. Like there has to be an intelligence behind it that is fixated on with certainly it takes shape obviously now, I think, more with men, but both man and woman has a part to play in it. And we, as far as we are from any type of good initiations for men these days, I'd say we're probably way further for women. There are no women cults anymore that actually are able to elicit and bring out that absolute woman in a way that is supposed to be in service to the absolute man. There's just what we see, there's OnlyFans whores and everything else.
Yes. Which is really, when you consider it, like the whole concept of like OnlyFans or the whole porn industry in general is it's like this very perverted degradation of the symbol of the unattainable woman, who is, and it's the unattainable woman who is
like $10 a month or whatever.
You can never touch her, and yet everybody possesses her.
Yeah.
And I can understand why men get really irritated and grossed out by this and think that like the state of women is so fallen when they see this, because you're kind of like Evola talks about how like nakedness for a woman is to it's to show herself in like her absolute like the pure feminine primordial power, that abyssal quality. And, if you look upon the naked woman and you're not qualified to do so, it has a really disastrous effect. Like you'll go blind, or in like the case of the Grail legend, where the Grail is basically a stand-in for the unattainable woman, is symbolically, you get sucked into a vortex or you get burned up or something like that. And so I think it was you even that told me that the Grail has inscribed on it the name of the person's beloved, and it's only that for that person that the woman is meant for. But like this whole concept of the unattainability of woman, it has to do, like on a metaphysical level, the fact that her nature is very fluid and very changeable. And yet within myth, we find these virgins who the symbol of the virgin is to represent that quality of unattainability. It's not like actual physical virginity, because you do then
Right.
see these women having like many lovers, and then they go bathe in the waters to restore their virginity. And, of course, the bathing in the waters is also very symbolic. And when you have like this unattainable woman, that there's this implicit sense that, okay, she's got this very like plastic fluid quality to her. There's no man who has come upon her and like impressed his form upon her and fixed her. That she is not the fixed waters yet. She's still the flowing waters.
Mm.
And so that's really linked to this quality of unattainability. But then when you see like with the Grail, where the man wins the woman whose name is inscribed on the Grail for him, that does represent a fixing of the waters, but it also symbolizes his victory and his glory.
Well, he at that stage is the vessel containing the waters. But what do you know? They're not mixed, right? Like the water is in the vessel contains the waters, and yet they're still separate.
Yeah.
They're not one essence. But in that mild separation, again, is Eros, is the power, is the generative, the virility, the abundance that the Grail is able to bestow. But and I hate to bring in television because I really don't watch any, but it reminds me just out of the blue, there's the show called, I think it's like The Last Kingdom or something like that.
Oh, I think I've seen some of that.
But there's one, I don't know what season or episode or anything, I've watched it sporadically, but there's one scene where the main character there's a Celtic kingdom, and it's like the castle is a barn. They're kind of poking fun at the Celts, right? And the king is this old, frazzled man, and his wife is this beautiful seeress. And the main character ends up taking her away, right? She's his war bride.
Ah, yes, I remember this.
But the king says you can't lie with her, because if you do, she will lose her prophetic powers. And so she's, obviously there's a huge element of the Celtic Grail legends, but I think that's a pretty profound way of encapsulating it in modern television, go figure, where Uhtred, that's his name, he can't sleep with her. And I think eventually they do, and she dies shortly thereafter. Like, so she gets beheaded on the battlefield or something like that. But her prophetic power was gone at that point. And I think that there's probably a real key to Eros in the Grail legends, in that conception of you can't fully possess the absolute woman. She can be yours in partnership or whatever, that's my queen, that's my war bride. It doesn't matter, but to fully possess her is to lose the power. Now it's
right.
fully,
like you can't subordinate her. She almost stands almost as an equal in her own right.
In the absolute man and woman form, for sure.
Yeah.
Because they are a dyad. And once they meld into one thing, here comes Rudra, plague Eros, split them up, and Eros begins. So to me, it almost seems like, because there's also basically the inevitability. I mean, realistically, there is always the inevitability of people coming together, right? No matter how they may be parted, lovers come together, and that's why it's usually tragic. But it's almost like this. I'm trying to think of the right, like a wavelength or something collapsing in upon itself. That there's this tension pulling them together. Eventually, they fuse into one, only to rebound out again. And I think, as a microcosm, that seems to be what they're discovering with, for instance, like quantum physics, right? There's this huge expansion, only to eventually collapse in upon itself, only to expand again, like a heartbeat. And it's interesting, the lovers are always assigned the heart space. Evola talks about, like, that's the seat of our consciousness, especially during our sleeping hours, which then ties in death and dreams. But that heartbeat has lulls, right? You're not one flat line. It's beat, pause, right? So to me, it seems like that process of separation, fusion, separation, fusion, back and forth, is what facilitates all of this. Is what facilitates life. The separation we feel from the divine, our time spent away, a reunion to the divine, and so on and so forth. But the microcosm of that is what's felt between lovers. And obviously, if you procreate, now's a new being is formed to go on its own path, to go on its own Eros adventure eventually, to seek its other half. Whether that's right or wrong, I mean, I'm firmly in the camp of we need more white babies, but I think it's interesting to note that it's an eruption, right? This fusion occurs, and then 9 months later, eruption of new life. It's the same process yet again.
Right. And you like see that everywhere in creation, this pulsing, this alternating of a beat and a silence and so forth. And it, then when you think about like that hermetic principle that everything vibrates, everything moves in the universe, everything has a vibrational level to it. It's like, well, that does make sense, because in order to exist, you have to have both spirit and matter. And so you have to have that continual pulsing between each, or the tension collapses. You can't have life if you have only matter, and you can't have life if you have only spirit. It can only exist in the gap between the two.
And this may be controversial to state it this way, but I can't think of a better way.
I like controversy.
Eternal life and eternal death seem like the exact same thing.
Yeah.
If you are completely face to face with God, to where there is no distinction, and all things, like the Buddhist take, right, till all sentient beings have been liberated from the bonds of life, and we're all just in this thing from where we all emerged, then there's nothing. There's no contrast. There's no richness of life. There's no struggle. There's no anything. And my concept of the divine accounts for that contest being part of it. And it could be on a massive scale, like one universe into another, and then it expands, and then it collapses into another. And it's this fractal replication that occurs endlessly. Because if you take it to a stage of where a lot of, again, Middle Eastern in particular, theology seems to point, well, it's death. It's eternal death, because nothing is occurring. There is no heartbeat anymore. That's not the same as eternal life in the sense of you're never aging, you're living in harmony and peace, but there's this other world that you can return to, or that that you came from. That still facilitates the tension, right? Because eventually, and this may be perhaps a new agey kind of belief, but it seems pretty relevant, especially within like the Celts. They talked about Caesar said they have zero fear of death because they know they'll be born again. There's probably a period where we're like, yeah, I think I'll give it another go. To me, that seems more logical than, oh, I fucked up, I ate the fruit, now I'm getting sent back to Earth. Like that just feels intuitively wrong to me.
Yeah, it feels intuitively wrong to me too. Kind of like thinking about what you said of like this sort of like this coming together and it being like this eruption and stuff. And
well, it's like light, right? Light,
right? Like eternal death and eternal life sort of being the same thing, which intuitively I agree with. Like I'd have to think about it a bit more to formulate like the philosophy and put it into like logical format and everything, which my little brain is not very good at doing. But the concept of like eternal life and eternal death, once again, we kind of have this theme of like love and death coming back together again, because love is always like felt as this very life affirming thing. Like you never feel more alive than when you're just falling in love. Like that's the best feeling, is when you're falling in love and you're just infatuated with this other person and all possibilities and hope is open to you. But yet we always find like this tragic ending for the most passionate love stories. And Evola kind of notes that there's an inverse relationship between the amount of sexual love and the amount of actual reproduction that occurs. Like the stronger the one, the weaker the other. And so why, like, just based on your understanding of myth and such, and like I know like you're really well versed in the Grail legends, especially. So feel free to draw on those if you want. Why do you think it's always this tragic ending for the most passionate love stories? Because when you think about it, like when I first read that in Eros and he made that point, I was like, yeah, now that I think about it, every love story I could come up with, and I'm just running through my head of all the different passionate love stories I've ever encountered. And I'm like, yeah, it really just wouldn't make sense for the story for them to end up with a whole brood of children living happily ever after with their white picket fence. Like there's just something that doesn't fit for me with that. There's and you can almost kind of like see it like, for example, when you consider like the difference between like Venus and the moon and their relative symbolisms, the Aphrodite and the Demeter, the type of like physiognomy of a woman that you would look at and be like, oh, she'd make a great mother. She looks really nurturing and really loving. She's always round like the moon. Like you could see like a nice round chubby woman and just imagine her holding a baby and being a great mom. But then you see like a really voluptuous like Pamela Anderson type, and nobody looks at that and thinks, oh, she'd be a great mom. Yes, she's got all the physical markers for fertility, but nobody sees her as the Demeter. They see her as the Aphrodite. And so it's really interesting to me that this Aphrodite archetype is much more associated with these tragic endings. And of course, the Aphrodite type goddesses are also tend to be linked to death and destruction in some way. Like there's that Durga element that comes forth much more. It's much more destructive in that quality. So
Well,
I'm curious what you think of that. What?
So, but we do have Artemis. So I think overall, though, I see what you're saying. I think if you look at it in the context of just like Aphrodite, Venus, and Aries, Mars, I can't remember the full myth, but where they're caught as illicit lovers. And Hermes, of course, catches them and he thinks it's hilarious because they're like all bound up together. And he makes a joke about how, well, he'd like to be in Mars's place. That wouldn't be so bad. But it's taboo. Something says this cannot be. And I think the tragic end, usually, yes, there's certainly like the hero dies in combat or something like that away from his beloved. But like in the context of Romeo and Juliet, the lovers,
somebody always dies.
Yeah, but
there's always a death.
The lovers take their own lives through a little bit of trickery, I guess, on the part of the gods in a way, but it comes from initially they're not allowed to be together, and something about the Eros between them views death together as a better end than a life apart. And I think it's that impulse towards union that is most pronounced when most forbidden, essentially. Because the
separating quality is so much stronger there by necessity.
And so what becomes of those lovers, I don't know. I think it certainly in like kind of the fallen context, right, that they've withheld their attachments to the world well enough that they're able to unite two halves of one whole to again be that. And because they haven't procreated, they haven't sustained that in a biological sense, the only parts of their true essence that get wound up together in a pure being continue on. But that's where it's kind of a cliffhanger, is because that's just an assumption, right? We don't have, nobody talks about that's where it ends. The lovers died.
Yeah.
That's always the ending. And so I'm not complete in my investigations on this either, because I think, again, if we go all the way back to the premise, and this forbidden nature, is the forbidden nature for a higher purpose that is the ultimate goal, or is the forbidden nature due to the necessity, like in the Greek cosmology, right? You have the Olympians, but above them you have the fates and necessity that govern even the Olympians. So I think whether it's the realm of fixed stars or whatever crazy system you want to put onto it, there's something else at play here that you got to gnaw on from it. And ultimately, obviously, all of us with lovers have to make our own call. I know for me, it being a Germanic descended person, I know very clearly my ancestors believed make babies, and together, especially intelligently, it's one thing like you have a one night stand and oh she's pregnant, like that's very different than two people in love, aware of the tension and the difficulties therein, consciously coming together to say, I want to bring new life into this world. And for my beliefs, that's an ancestor that's returned. But is that something completely unique or cut off from the tragic lovers who are imperiled from the first moment they saw one another because they are squarely fixated on the absolute man and absolute woman being reunited? And if that's the case, what becomes of that union? Because we don't know. To my knowledge, there's literally no myth about that. There's just guidance and initiation ceremonies and mystical practices to make use of that tension. But you could apply it, I guess, to like achieving pure Atman or like the rainbow body. I know Serrano certainly talks about, when his lover dies, he carries her heart in his chest so that when he dies, they become a Vimana spaceship and blast off to the cosmos or whatever. So there's different ways to conceptualize it. But as far as the historical sources go, there doesn't really seem to be any evidence or any sway to dictate what that means, other than it's that tragedy and death was there from the very beginning, because
it's kind of baked into the cake, isn't it?
Yeah, it's baked into the cake. And even, I mean, is it really like certainly in literacy, there's more common of that tragic love story, but can anybody say that, two individuals that lived their whole lives together and they had 10 kids or whatever, and one dies and then a week later the other one dies because they couldn't be apart, is any less different? It's still a tragic love story. It's just got a little bit more time and mileage on it. So I think that all lovers are ultimately fated for a tragic end because you've loved. Like
inevitably, yes.
That's the trade-off. You have loved. You must die. Like you're going to be brokenhearted in one way or another, because we don't really know. I know everybody likes to speculate and everybody likes to claim their tradition knows for certainty, but we don't really know what happens. Yeah. I love sorry, in the Vedas, it talks, they're recounting the creation myth and who did what. And then the poet says, but who can really say? Because nobody fucking knows. People want to know. And that again is that Eros tension of like, I need to know. I need to feel close to the divine. I need to figure this out. But you're separated. There's a veil between us. And we have to cross that veil inevitably. And then we'll find out. But until then, we just have to contend with the tension and the tragedy that tension inevitably, whether it's in the course of an 80-year marriage or an illicit love affair, it always ends in tragedy. But it's, especially like if we think about just the Greek tragedy, that's the beauty of life. That's why the gods are jealous of us at times, right? Because we have a mortal life. And it's filled with such high victories and such horrible lows, and we ache and we yearn and we strive. And to them, that's beautiful. And I would agree. I think that is what's beautiful. It's that contrast. That tragedy is what gives the richness of every kiss, every holding hands, all of it. Like, it's worth it, because inevitably the tragedy arrives. But if the tragedy arrives without any love preceding it, well, then it's really tragic, right? Then it's just,
yeah. I think also it's maybe worth, like, in regards to the question of like reproduction and versus not. I do think Evola makes some good points in that the most passionate love stories don't result in children. And he even notes that, the more passionate it is, the more sterility there tends to be almost by default. But right. I think, we kind of have to make this distinction between the horizontal path, which is the reproduction. And all traditional societies essentially had this concept that, you know, you do have to have children in order to pass on the ancestral rights. And if you fail to do this, like, this is a serious crime against the ancestors. And so you do have to have success on the horizontal path. But the type of like sexual love that Evola is talking about, that are these tragic love stories, is more like the vertical path. And if you were to take that to its logical conclusion through, like, for example, some of the stuff he talks about in the book regarding like sexual magic and the evocations and everything, where, you know, you're basically having theoretically people die from like Kundalini awakening or something. Like, if it were to get like really intense, you could theoretically like burn out those circuits in a person. And maybe then, you know, if you did it right and you ascend through your crown chakra and turn into some etheric being and leave your body behind or something, like, that would be weird, but also like a tragedy. Right. But I don't necessarily think that the horizontal path and the vertical path are mutually exclusive, because like even within the Vedic system, you have like this, I forget the word, but where you've got like these four, like these different stages of life.
Your Svadharmas.
Yeah. And so, you know, at certain ages, you're supposed to be fulfilling certain things. And so you've got the four aims of life. You need to fulfill your dharma and your artha and kama before you can go off and be a wandering monk to pursue moksha.
Yeah.
Right. And you have to fulfill these material obligations first before you can pursue spiritual liberation.
Yeah. I think unless you're a lucky enough person, I don't even know if it's luck, but if you're a conditioned type of person to where, like, from the moment of birth to death, like, you've been on the ascetic path, and it's just, you know, like maybe, you know, some of the monks in Tibet or something like that, where that is their sole fixation. And certainly, you know, with like the clergy, right, in a kind of modern sense of it, if they're not like diddling little kids, they are trying to be celibate, they're trying to get close to God, and they're fixated squarely on that. But for the vast majority of people, and certainly, you know, Evola always kind of elevates the warrior caste and the king above the priestly caste. Warrior castes were, I mean, at least in the genetic record, pretty much the whole reason any of us are alive today. So I think, again, it probably does have a lot to do with the caste, because the three lower castes, unless you're part of the Brahmin caste, procreation and rearing a family is part of your dharma anyway. But then at a later stage in life where that's been fulfilled, you're meant to turn inward and really focus on that spiritual work. Obviously, you can do a little bit of both. You know, I think everybody should have a spiritual practice, regardless of where they're at in life. But I would say it's probably a select group that would be equipped to only focus on the vertical axis through the entirety of their life. And, you know, I've said something like this before, but to me, that is not heroic. That is, but I'm clearly not of that caste. Like I may be really into spiritual and esoteric matters, but I will never be somebody that can just only focus on that, because I have to find a way to meld whatever my spiritual work is with my physical temporal reality. And that is through conquest, that is through war, that is through things that are part of my being as a physical creature.
You are a very Marsy person.
Yeah, I got that right. But I do think that they're not mutually exclusive. Only because, again, if we're thinking hermetically, right, everything's on a spectrum. So on one full side of the spectrum, you have the vertical axis, and the other side of that, you have the horizontal axis. But most people are somewhere in the middle. And as you get older, you move. Obviously, you're getting closer to death. You're going to be more inward focused. You're going to be focusing more on those spiritual matters. But I can't remember the guy's name. There's Robert Sepher, I think, always references him when he's doing his like crazy frill videos and stuff, but talking about like Chinese Taoist philosophy and sexual magic and all that. And he's talking about like He's a real well-known guy. I can't remember his name, but I don't speak Mandarin. Anyway, he always is talking about it's never too late to do this. And if you fall off it, I guess this would kind of tie into things like no fab. Like if you fuck up, you can always return to it. So I think obviously it's Evola we're discussing here. So Evola is very black and white in all things. This is the only way. But to me, it does seem like there is a spectrum, and that spectrum we all fall scattered about in slightly different areas. But whatever you naturally gravitate towards is probably the correct path for you. And as wonderful as it might be to assume, this incarnation is the one where I ascend and I get it. How many times have you how many times have you said that before, right?
Me, never.
Well, I'm just saying
I expect I'll need many more.
well, in like other lifetimes, right? Because again, if fate and necessity are governing all of this at a higher echelon, that's already again, like I'm a Germanic guy. I'm big into fate and doom. Like you can't escape it. It is what it is. It's fixed. It's set. There's nothing you can do to change it. All you can do is meet that with a pure heart and pure intentions and heroic action. So whatever moment I'm supposed to become enlightened is already set. I just have to do my work in the meantime. And I'm less concerned if that takes a million incarnations or if it just takes this one, because either way, I'm fulfilling my dharma. And I really think that for most people, that's probably a better way to look at it. Like what's going to happen is going to happen. This whole process happened. Was it a mistake on the God's part? I don't know. I don't think so. But you're in the middle ground. We're in Midgard contending with it. So how do you go about traversing that? Most people find happiness and joy in family. Most people find happiness and joy in a fulfilling work or career that they can put a higher motivating factor behind and say, this is what I did it for. I did it for my family. I did it for the divine. Very few people can say, I'm extremely happy because I'm an ascetic devoted to every day of my life. And if we could talk to them, which we probably won't because they probably aren't using the internet, we're never going to know for sure if that's right for us.
Interestingly, I've known a few people who have gone and spent extended periods of time living as like monks in temples in the Orient, and every single one of them reports that all of their fellow monks are struggling with an excess of sexual problems, like porn addictions are really common there, and so on and so forth. And I think, that's kind of interesting just from like a consideration of the study of Eros. And, I have heard from men who have gone on like meditation retreats and stuff that after a while they get really deep into the meditation and they can't stop thinking about sex. And
it's inborn.
Yeah.
Around it. That Eros is a naturally arising thing. It's a mysterious thing. It's a difficult thing, but it's like when Evola is talking about the eunuchs, right? And their sexual urges are even worse after they've been castrated. There's specific to Middle Eastern cultures and to a lesser degree South Asian cultures, there is an escapism tendency that many Westerners look at as they're enlightened. But I think if you dig a little bit deeper, it's I can't overcome this, so I'm going to completely block it out. I'm not going to be playing with the fire. I'm just going to lock myself in a dark room so that the fire can't hurt me. But then the fire's in your mind, and you can't escape that.
And that's why Evola says it's really destructive if all you're doing is suppressing and repressing it instead of actively engaging with it as something that can be something that makes you stronger.
Or that you can create with, because that's something that is definitely relevant and definitely has a pretty broad overview of like examples, right? So many people that have been quote unquote celibate and they've created a symphony or like Tesla, for instance, and all these things. But they've
transmuted it.
right, they transmuted it. So they placed it they placed a higher ideal to utilize that tension with. And I think that of what Evola is trying to put forward is that's possible, but you can't suppress it. It has to be aroused, it has to be awakened, and then redirected. And that can be redirected in a multitude of ways. But it's probably the most difficult to only redirect it into I'm going to ascend, awaken the chakras, and all that kind of thing. And I can't. Is it an doctrine of awakening where he's talking about because we're in Kali Yuga, we have to make use of the tools that are. We have to make use of the poison, right? Like all these things that plague our societies. As wonderful as it may be as an impulse to just block them out, you can't. They've already infected your mind. Like we're already aware of them. So how can you utilize them to do the transmutation and redirect that current into a positive outlet? Again, I'm not saying that for some people it's not possible or the right path to go ascetic and to be able. I'm sure that there's people that have achieved that, but for the most part, Westerners do not fall in that camp. We've already taken the path of Exodus. We've already moved in accordance with, for thousands of years, this using that energy to overcome our natural environment and to build monuments to that overcoming. And I think there's no time to stop doing that.
Yeah, that's a good segue into the last topic I had on my list, and I wasn't quite sure how I was going to tie it in with the rest, but this idea that, bringing it into like this, the first appearance of Eros at puberty,
Yeah.
and how there have always been all these initiation rites within traditional societies that take place at puberty. And the goal is to sort of fix that force of sex before it becomes like too out of control, essentially, to fix it so that it can be transmuted. And Evola talks about like when that first force of sex first appears in puberty, like if it's not being channeled or if it's deviated in some way, that you kind of get all of these unhealthy symptoms like hysterical fits and melancholy and manic depression, and your intellectual development kind of halts while you fixate on the opposite sex. Or and he even says like attacks of masturbatory derangement, which I think probably fits every teenage boy pretty well.
And today we just shrug that off. Oh, that's what they do.
Yeah, and instead of seeing it as the force of Eros not flowing the way that it should be, it's actually a symptom of Eros kind of going wrong in a sense. And then you also he draws the link between like the awakening of the sexual awakening to also the awakening of religious feelings around the same time, and that that it often coincides with like this spiritual crisis in the teenager. They feel like incomplete and imperfect, and they're all anguished, and they're doing all this unhealthy introspection, all this navel gazing, and they're anxious, and they just have like this vague inward dissatisfaction with themselves and their life. And that is linked to the first appearance of Eros. And you mentioned when we talked earlier that the Koryos tradition sort of had their own way of dealing with this. So I was wondering if you could say a bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, especially tying in the religious angle, because most likely there's this coinciding effect of recognizing the self from another, right? Whether it's the self from God, obviously, like that starts to develop when you're a toddler or whatever, or when you're a baby and you start to recognize yourself in the mirror, for instance, and then you can see other people like, oh, that's not me. But it really does turn into a crisis when Eros hits with puberty, because now there's this whole flood of this whole new sensation that's pulling you towards this other person that you hadn't even considered in that way before. Or maybe it's not even reached that stage of development yet. You just don't know what's going on. So in in Eros, Evola talks about the initiatory rites with men and women, or young boys and girls. At that time they would be separated, right? For the men in particular, it's important because at least in the Koryos tradition, it looks like it starts around age 8 or 9, that typically the maternal uncle, that was kind of a unique Indo-European relationship, would begin taking the boy out hunting trips, pulling him away from the world of women. Presumably, on one account, because he's going to be a problem if he's around just a little boy. He's like getting a heart on or something. He's like, wow, what's going on? There's all these women around. You can't really have that. So that's certainly part of it. But then as he gets older and really hits that puberty wall, 15, 16 or whatever, that's when, for the most part, the initiation right into the Koryos would take place. So now you're fully pulled away from the world of women. There is no mommy anymore. There's no cute girl anymore. It's just you and the boys and a really daunting ritual ahead of you, that on the other side is death, because you're going to die to your old self and be reborn into this manor bond. And so I think that redirection of Eros, I would wager that there probably was like a spiritual or mystical components as far as the education is concerned, but we don't know. We don't have sources of that. We just have evidence and sources to show the ritual and then what happened after the ritual, where they were in a Koryos and, cattle raiding and hunting and living in the wilds like wild beasts. But they're given that liminal space to behave like wild beasts, to behave like a boy in puberty. And it's interesting to note too, although most modern people would certainly scoff at this, like it was permissible to raid another culture and take their women, right? Like that's how most Indo-European societies were formed. Was the men of a Koryos would go cattle raid, they get all the goods, all the cattle, they would kill all the men, they would take all the women, and then what do you know? You have a new tribe. So I think it's difficult for us to conceptualize that in the modern times, but I would argue that that's probably a healthier way of dealing with it than, hey, look at this computer screen porn and just write it off. Oh, this is what little boys do. Because that does short circuit, and that does rewire neural networks that are extremely damaged by that point. And there's a tremendous amount of difficulty to get them back on track, if at all. So allowing a stage of development to occur where those impulses can be utilized for the furthering of the tribe, the furthering of the folk, the gaining of resources and new lands, seems to me like an early precursor of these. They probably developed over time, and then they got more complex with specific practices or redirections of that energy and that charge. But there's certain I'd be hard pressed to see that as not a good outlet. We're talking Copper Age, Bronze Age here when these men are doing, these boys are doing this. A good outlet for those impulses that otherwise could be redirected in violence or harm on one's own society, on one's own kin, even, right? So I don't know how many. I think he talks about the Eleusinian mysteries as well. I don't know what the age time was for that, but certainly in Sparta, in Greece, they had their own versions of the Koryos later on. But that transition period that is fueled with Eros energy seems to have a long-standing tradition of being redirected specifically to warfare and the preparation of men for warfare. So, and then war brides were the main loot, right? So there is yet again that tie-in to death and the beloved on the other side of it. To die during that time period was glorious. You'll get a mound out of it. To gain fame and renown, you had to succeed. You had to get the cattle. And it's interesting too in the sources. There's often this overlap between women as cattle as women, like and it being Feiyu, wealth, right? They're all one and the same thing because they're the building blocks of a society. So it does seem like the Koryos utilized that time period specifically to prepare young men for a hard life ahead of them. And then it's interesting too that although there's less source material for this, after a period in the Koryos, they would usually return, if they hadn't started their own society and said, I'm going to stay here, they would usually return to their host societies, and there'd be a cleansing ritual to restore them back to good standing in their community. Now they're no longer an outlaw. And at that stage, I would imagine there would probably be further development of how to redirect that Eros tension in a way that then manifests in creative works for the tribe or leadership capabilities or being, a good ruler. But that's speculation on my part.
One thing that Evola mentions and that I've found just in my own research as well is that these puberty initiation rites across cultures kind of seem to focus on themes of death and rebirth.
Mm-hmm.
Like even like within the Australian Aboriginals, which their culture is really quite interesting because you can almost kind of see that maybe at one point they were a traditional society and it's just become so degenerated, but there's like still these like little remnants there. Okay. And they take boys around the same age as the Koryos did, and it is usually organized by the maternal uncle similarly. And they basically take the boy and they tell him it's time for him to die. And of course, the little boys have no idea about this ritual. They have no clue. And they're basically taken by this group of men, and they go through it's like several days that this takes place over. It's usually quite painful. Often there's like some circumcision involved, or like being poked with sharp sticks or being scarred in some way. And these death and rebirth initiation rituals were always kind of considered that this is what's needed to make you into a man. This is what separates you from the women and the babies and the animals, is to undergo this. And of course, initiation is meant to sort of produce this ontological change. And so it's kind of interesting that they're taking these boys at puberty, at the age when they're first getting interested in love and sex. But before they get too interested, right? You don't want it to like fully flourish yet. You want to take them a bit before, just at the first, and they would take these boys at the first signs of puberty. Like as soon as they notice that the boy is hitting puberty, it's time for him to go and die. And all the women participate, like they'll cry and weep. Oh no, please don't take my son. We'll miss him so much. And the women kind of play their role in it.
It's also true. See, they really are dying at that stage. Like the mom is literally losing their little baby boy.
Yeah. And so
young man.
But it's interesting that they are taking that force of love and sex and then linking it to this death. And so Evola says kind of in regards to, like, not this specifically, but it's related. He says the painful nature of pain is due to the passive character of the experience and to the identification of the ego as if through fear, not with the force that alters its existential unity and carries it virtually beyond, but with that which undergoes the alteration, not with that which strikes, but with that which is struck. And I think that's a really interesting quote to include in this book and in the context of the conversation of these puberty initiation rituals that involve death and pain. This idea that there's this concept that if something's painful, it's because your ego identification is is being the thing that's suffering, right? Not the thing that is causing the suffering, essentially. And isn't it kind of the case that if you're initiated into manhood, one of the changes that initiation should kind of be producing is to see yourself as the thing that strikes and not the thing that is struck, is to take you out of that passive experience and into an active experience, which is more proper to the masculine.
Yeah, for sure. And I think
do the Koryos do anything similar?
It's hard to say because so much of this is in the process of being reconstructed. And we have to add on the layer, these were mystery cults that were cast as outsiders that were pretty secretive, right? So my inclination is to say that, yeah, that would have definitely been part of it. I think it's also interesting to note that yet again, we're seeing this theme of severing, right? You're being severed from your old life, you're dying to it, and now you're being reborn, which immediately on the other side of that, there's going to be that I miss home, I miss my family, I miss, the cute girl from the village, whatever it may be. And carrying those longings while growing into manhood. And that is, the Koryos were believed to be, when they were reborn as not just like, because both the Celts and the Germans, presumably all Indo-Europeans, believe that when you physically are born, it's an ancestor coming back, at least as some part of your spirit, kind of like in the tripartite soul analogy. But when you die and are reborn into the Koryos, you become part of that ancestral force itself. And so you're still dead, technically, in that, like, you're undead, hence one of the modern views of like a werewolf is they're undead, right? They're not living, they're not dead, they're somewhere in between. I also think it's interesting that modern werewolf lore has this connection often to the werewolf in a fit of rage killing their beloved. So there's these overlapping themes of severance, departure, and then the longing for unity that cannot be, because if it is, well, the whole process was for nothing, right? Like, if you just turn tail and run back to the village, back to mommy, like, you're never going to be a man in this society, like, get lost, loser. That's not going to happen. So
you kind of have to overcome all that sadness and yearning and get through it.
And to what degree there was emphasis placed on you are the one doing the severing, it's hard to gauge. But the reason I say I'd be inclined to think it is because, again, you're assuming the function of the ancestors, which are dead. So if you are the ancestor killing the old part of yourself, never to see it again, there has to be that assumption of the new role as the one holding the knife, right? Because otherwise it's like a schizophrenic state. You're in two places at once. And I think that's critical to the process, because you can't just feel yourself to die like, oh, this is an analogy, this is a ceremony, it's metaphorical. Like, no, you are literally dying and being reborn as an ancestral force that then carries you forward into a new mode of being entirely. And to transform in that nature, you have to be the active participant. It can't be passive, because that's what they're channeling, is that ancestral active force.
Right. So just to then kind of finish up, I'm curious what you would say. Like, you're somebody who works with a lot of young men, and I know that you have clients who, sometimes maybe come to you with some questions about some of these sorts of topics. It is a common thing for young men today to be struggling with sex and love and all of that sort of stuff. So what advice would you have to give to a young man today who has no initiatic pathway? He didn't get the benefit of being a Koryos, and he's maybe struggling with some of these common problems that men today face, like, porn addictions and inceldom and all of these other kind of struggles that young men are having today. What would be your advice to them?
The first thing that comes to mind is in Eros, Evola talks about, it didn't matter what age you were, if you didn't go through that initiation, you were not a man. Obviously, none of us had the luxury of going through an initiation when we were 8 years old to 16 years old. So we're kind of winging it. But I think it starts with not rejecting or not trying to suppress these things initially. I think that really is a very detrimental way to go about it. But to locate these things within yourself and to acknowledge them and recognize that there is tremendous power there. I think if you see it first and frame it as a source of power that just is needing to be tapped into or transmuted effectively, that starts to peel back the layers of like this victim mentality. Like, I get it. We all have to, you try and get on X or Twitter or whatever, and you're just wanting to look at some sweet fast wave video or something like that, and there's 10 porn bots before you get there. So like it's a real contention that we have to deal with. But blocking those things out, although effective on a surface level, does not touch or really mitigate what's taking place internally and on a spiritual level. So identifying those things as real and from within you as much as they're reflected outside of you and provoked from outside of you is the first stage, because you have to be able to access and harness that energy, even if detrimentally at first, right? Like you start to tap into this and now you relapse or whatever the case may be. But the process always, it's almost like, I hate to use the analogy, but like Alcoholics Anonymous, like, I mean, there's a problem, but the problem is first in the framing, because it's a naturally arising thing. It's a natural energy. It's a natural source of existence that you then have to intelligently redirect. And ways of redirecting it, obviously, the very best of which would be creative outlets. You could put all your efforts into trying to get a partner or something like that. But especially for like the incel dudes, like, just because you feel like you're not able to talk to women or get what you want, or you feel inferior or whatever the case may be, well, how do you build value? You redirect and make use of that energy to create something, to produce something, to put something into the world that is of you, that you've been bringing forth. And then gradually that can shift into companionship, right? Whether it's romantic or with like a brotherhood, or you start to build something. Say you pick up the guitar and you start getting good at the guitar. Now you are forming a band. Now you're writing music with a group of guys. Like it's building blocks. So I think, especially for young men today, because we don't have these initiatory practices, it's all well and good to research them. And certainly if you're interested in getting more knowledge on them, or trying to formulate some sort of ritual for yourself, like get in contact with me, I'm happy to help. But it always begins with first acknowledging that on your own individual level, because like we just talked about, you are the one doing the action. You have to take command of it. You have to say, I sever this now. I'm being reborn. There's lots of gripes about self-initiation and all this, that, and the other. But the reality is, like, what are we supposed to do? Just sit on our asses and just hope, a perfect.
You got to try something.
Got to try something. And I think if we're thinking of Eros as this magnetic draw towards something, then put something there. And allow that tension to build and contend with it and work with it until you are accomplishing something. And using that as your own blueprint or template towards a form of self-initiation, I think starts to empower you to then be able to do a little bit more difficult things. Like if you do want to practice Kundalini energy working, or you're trying really hard to go on the ascetic path, or you want to go join the military and you want to pass the test to get into the job, or whatever it may be, it starts with acknowledging what you're working with, and then channeling that effectively towards some aim that is achievable at first, and then building from there, and recognizing that it's you doing all those things. Otherwise, you're overwhelmed by this Eros, right? This other current, but almost like riding the tiger, right? Like you got to get on its back, and you have to channel it, because nobody else is going to do it for you, unfortunately. And hopefully, within our lifetimes, I'm certainly trying to figure out how to do this without being called a fed every day. Initiatory infrastructure for young men in particular, so that some of these more traditional means of dealing with this can be integrated into a society that we want to live in. But until that happens, it starts with individuals just taking the mantle on their own and really trying and, reaching out for help if you need to. But you have to be the one holding the knife and cutting that cord.
Right. Like you're never going to get rid of the Eros impulse. So it's up to you as to whether or not you allow it to become a destructive force, or whether you can turn it into something that's a creative force.
and you're still alive, so it's not too late.
Yes, exactly,
It,
exactly.
not in the like, oh, we're all redeemed if we believe this one thing kind of way, but like because your own fucking merit, because you decided to take the active role. Now you're redeeming. That's to me, I think is critically missing in young men in general today. Um, but it doesn't mean it's not there, even if it's just hibernating for the time being.
And do you think it would be useful for them to maybe sort of keep in mind the idea of like the woman of the mind to orient themselves around until they find their person?
Yeah, well, especially because porn is so prevalent, like it's critical to understand there is the absolute woman that is above any woman that is attainable for any man. She's reflected in all women, and there's varying degrees at how much of that absolute woman is incarnated within any woman that you encounter. But the constant reaffirmation of pedestal worship will just destroy you when you try and actually get into a real relationship. So breaking away from these idealized formats of, I want a perfect trad wife that's never even been online and she's obsessed with everything I'm obsessed with and she'll cook me chicken tendies and all just these bizarre things that you see online. I think our coping mechanisms ultimately at a deep dissatisfaction of being unable to cope with the reality that Eros provokes, which is you will never obtain the unattainable woman, but you can obtain a woman that is a complement to you, so much so that you both are able to bring out those absolute forms within your relationship. But that's critically important to not just be worshiping the pedestal or Aphrodite up there on the shelf like that. That can be an object of inspiration, but assuming that if you just do no fat for 6 months and hit the gym every day, you will achieve that is faulty. You have to take an active role initially, and part of that is recognizing what is flesh and blood realistic for you to have in a companion.
Well, thank you very much, Jake, for having this discussion with me.
Absolutely.
I understand, you've got your Koryos Academy website, which everybody can go visit that and see what kind of services you offer. Jake does astrology readings just like I do. I often recommend clients to go see Jake as well, just for a male perspective, since a lot of my clients are male. And I think, sometimes there's a limit to how much I, as a woman, can tell them about some of their issues, especially if they're of like a sort of more Eros type nature. So please go check out Jake's website and check out everything that he's offering here, because he's very accomplished, very intelligent and learned, as you all can probably tell. So, Jake, do you have anything other than your website that we should know about? Anything else that you're working on, or is this your main project right now?
That's pretty much the main project. I have an Instagram, also Koryos Academy, and I have an X account, but I'm pretty lazy on it, to be honest with you. I'm going to, if anybody is interested in doing an outing, so like when we go out to Appalachia or possibly other locations, I'm also interested in alternative places if we can congregate in one. I'm trying to get a bigger group together so that we can make it a little bit more intensive. It helps to spread out the weight, and it helps to have guys to go through something that's pretty striking ordeal. So it says sold out on there, but really just email me if you're interested in that. If you have a group of guys in your area that may be interested in it, I'm also open to traveling there and we can facilitate it. If there's a nature preserve or some mountains or something like that, we can figure something out. So I'll probably update the website to make that a little bit more concise. Other than that, yeah, I do astrology readings. I frame them essentially within this context, and I think I've had like two female clients ever. I've had hundreds of male clients, so it seems to resonate with a little bit more of the male crowd, which is fine by me because that's really where my passion lies, is helping young men. And the goal is basically to help you understand your base self as far as the natal promise, what we would call forecasts, and that way you can start to find these parts of yourself internally and look at ways to integrate them with physical action, with other men if possible. But it seems to be pretty helpful for guys that are just trying to either make a career change or figure out what they're trying to do in life, to just to understand how they're composed initially, because a lot of times we have to be told this is what you're like.
Yeah. I think a birth chart reading is such a helpful tool for self-discovery.
That's insane. And then I also offer, if you're interested in paganism, how to work with the planets as basically signs of the gods. So like in the omen sense, and you can kind of time rituals and develop a relationship with the gods in that way too. So not strictly astrological as far as the birth chart goes, but a good way to interact with the gods on a daily basis or through transits.
Excellent. Well, I recommend Jake to everybody, of course. And thank you once again, Jake, for coming on. I'll make sure to put all your links in the description. It was a great chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kat.